Hi, everyone. This is William Ford from AMC Presents. Today, I'm going to be talking with composer Tree Adams. Tree has an amazing musical heritage. We'll be exploring that a bit. We'll also be talking about his career as a rock musician, as a soundtrack composer, and as well as being a classical composer. We'll be talking specifically about his new composition called Elements 4, which deals with the climate crisis. Just a reminder to be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. That helps us get recognized by that algorithm. Also, remember to go over to www.patreon.com/Atlanta Music Critic and support us at any level. Again, thanks for watching. Let's join Tree. Hey there.
Hey, how's it going?
It's good. I'm absolutely always amazed when it works.
Yeah, well, here we are.
Welcome to Atlanta Music Critic.
Thank you.
Appreciate you taking the time to chat with us.
Thanks for having me. It's like to be here with you.
I'm a psychologist,
Mhm,
so I kind of like to talk a little bit about background before we
mhm.
get talking about today.
Sure.
So I like to explore how people got to be where they are.
Mhm.
And I know there's a lot of information about you on the internet, so anybody who wants to find out detailed information, they certainly can do that. But I'd like to just get a little bit of a personal spin on it and see how you got
Sure.
to be where you got to be.
Absolutely.
So, any questions for me before we begin?
No, I mean, I guess maybe. How did you get into classical music from being a psychologist?
I started out when I was very young, when I was in Philadelphia. It was about maybe when I was 10 or 11. And I had a neighbor who introduced me to classical music. And so she had a big influence on how I grew to love classical music. But in addition, when you were growing up in the 1950s, as I was, there was a lot of classical music on television. Playhouse 90, they would use Prokofiev a lot. And of course, who knew? Lone Ranger had a lot of classical music in it. I kind of had a foundation there, but she actually introduced me to it. And so it's kind of been from there on, I've always been a good listener. And that's kind of the question I wanted to ask you. But to begin with, where were you born?
I was born in Berkeley, California, and I had hippie parents. I guess I moved to New York City when I was about 2 or 3 years old. And then I would say, college age, I started to go travel. Like I spent a lot of time on the road in a rock band and actually went to school in Philadelphia. But so, yeah, that's kind of how it came up. And then I've been in California for 25, 30 years, something like that.
Are you back to the Bay Area or are you in another section of California?
No, we're in Los Angeles.
Okay. When you moved to New York when you were 3 years old, how was that for you? I mean, what was it like for you growing up in New York?
My father had been, and he played in Country Joe and the Fish and with Lightning Hopkins and with all these blues guys in Chicago. And then Country Joe and the Fish was kind of a big part of the 60s Bay Area music. Things didn't work out with my mom, so she took me back east. My grandmother was there and my grandfather were there, and they were very helpful in raising me, and they were really into classical music. So I had kind of these two sides. This classical music side, very like traditional training, theory and listening to Beethoven, Bach, Brahms, all the classics. And then I had also this kind of folk and blues thing because my grandfather had started Vanguard Records with his brother Maynard. So there were all of these records, including the stuff that my father had done from Country Joe and the Fish around the house. So I kind of grew up listening to a lot of blues and jazz and folk, and then a lot of classical music. And then the grandparents like teaching me from like the time I was 3 or 4 years old.
I do remember Vanguard Records. In the 60s, for example, I became really involved with hi-fi and audio equipment. And of course, Vanguard was an important component of that at the time.
Well, they were kind of early on in experimenting with, quadraphonic sound, which is kind of the grandfather of surround that we have now. My grandfather was really interested in creating the most immersive experience possible with the orchestra. So, he was constantly striving on the technical front. So what you're talking about, like he commissioned some of the first Neve consoles and Dolby decks. And, it was kind of early in recording. So, a lot of those recordings back in the day were like, it was mono, or you had, four channels, like a mic tree in the front, and like a couple, and they were trying to give you as much of an immersive experience. I think that's the word I keep coming back to. So that was a thing they were striving for. And I think some of those records, they have the most pleasant sound to them. I mean, obviously recording an orchestra to tape through tube microphones and tube EQs and mic pre's, it's just, you feel it right in here. It transcends. So yeah, that was kind of my legacy. That was what's going on.
That Vanguard catalog has kind of changed hands times since the time of your grandfather.
Yeah, I think in the 80s he sold it to Lawrence Welk's grandson, I believe. And they were focused a little bit more on like the blues, and I think they did something good with it. And then I don't know where it is now, actually. My father was Seymour Solomon, and his brother Maynard Solomon was more interested, I think, by the end in, some of his intellectual pursuits. He wrote all of these actually, very psychological biographies of Beethoven, Mozart. He was kind of a student of these composers, and really the nexus of like composers and, maybe like Jungian psychological analysis. It was sort of an interesting thing. He really wanted to move into that, so they sold the company, and then my grandfather went on to Omega Records, it was called. He had some recordings, I think a lot of stuff in Vienna that he went and remastered and put out on this other little label that was smaller. But anyway, that was always sort of the backdrop in my, growing up. And, meanwhile, I picked up a guitar and I kind of got into blues and rock and roll and traveling and doing that as well. So that's kind of part of my bag.
When did you start to play the guitar?
I picked up the guitar when I was 12. I had played in orchestras at school, like growing up. I played clarinet and flute, and I always sang. I figured it'd be fun, socially playing a guitar, being in a band. It was kind of a fun thing to do. I think also probably if we're going to go with the psychological angle, like I was chasing like what my father did. I wanted to know like what drew him to being on the road and out there. Maybe there's a ghost that I was following out there somehow.
Do you remember a pivotal moment when you said to yourself, indeed, I do have to do this? Maybe you didn't. It's all right. But anyway, if something that sticks in your head that says, that was a defining moment for me in my music career.
Well, I think I can't put it on a single moment, but I feel like there were a series of inspiring concerts I saw. I mean, I could actually pick the first moment where I felt music like blooming literally like in my chest, like a physical feeling. I think I was 4 years old. I was like in summer camp. I was singing as part of like an ensemble with a bunch of other kids, and they had us do a round. And we were singing Boondiata. But it was like once the round kicked in and there were these different sort of harmonic layers, these counter melodies going, I felt this bloom. And I remember, so there was like 4 years old. I was like, this is working for me. And then I think there were a series of moments of being inspired at a concert in all genres. I mean, I remember seeing Pete Seeger, when I was a kid, and I was like, wow, I was moved by him. I remember going and seeing, an orchestra play Mahler, just like exploding. I think in the 70s, I saw the Bee Gees. I was like, staying alive, boom. So I'm kind of equally moved by a variety of different genres. I still, to this day, my default probably is in the world of classical music. I listen to a lot of Stravinsky and a lot of Mahler. I listen to a lot of jazz. To me, that's kind of when I'm sitting around cooking, and that's my happy place. I listen to a lot of blues. So I'm a lover of all music.
Did you have a mentor at some point other than your family members who really made a big impact on you with regard to a music career?
I went to Bard College briefly, and I was a music major there. And this guy, Luis Garcia Renart, was my teacher, and he was, I guess, the first cellist for the Hudson Valley Philharmonic. He was just one of those people who, like, he was an open channel. Music came from the heavens through him, and he just manifested. He could play anything. He could read. He could improvise. He was incredibly flexible with the styles of music that he could operate in. He was incredibly adept at dealing with, people in a classroom who were from different backgrounds, both musically and, the kinds of people you're dealing with. And some of them were very quirky. I remember we had a situation where we were doing a performance class, and there was this one guy who was doing something avant-garde that was like, it just seemed like too self-indulgent, and I was getting bored. I was like, I'm sitting here for 3 hours and we have to watch this guy he's just banging. He's like got a piano open and he's banging on it with like shoes and doing weird things. And like, it's just, we're supposed to make comments about it. And I was like, come on. In the end, Luis had the guy play something, like a strict classical piece, like he was playing some Rachmaninoff or something crazy, and I was like, okay, so he's technically good. Okay, great. Had the guy play his performance piece. Luis sat down at a blackboard as it was going and like wrote the whole thing out. It was very abstract and crazy. And then he went and sat down at the piano and like replicated it almost exactly instantly. He tried to make the point that like this young man was like super talented. He was conveying something that like he was looking for something, and that we needed to kind of go on his journey with him in order to get something out of it. The fact that Luis was willing to indulge this and dive into this piece with this young man and showed the rest of us too, because a lot of us were really like getting tired of it and skeptical. It was a wonderful demonstration of patience, skill, and a thing that I think is essential to progress with music, which is the sense of awe and wonder. And if you can imbue your path with awe and wonder on a continual basis, you can grow. When you rely on the same algorithm to create your works, you start to kind of get stale. You don't evolve. You forego the opportunity to break through. I think that was really special somehow, that moment. And then I think otherwise, career-wise, I've had a couple of collaborators. I was in this band, the Hatters, for almost a decade, touring, and that was like a sort of bluesy rock band. And the other guitar player in that project, Adam Evans, was particularly good. He had a big influence on me. And then I think once I became a composer for film and television, I had the opportunity to collaborate with Tyler Bates, who was a bit older than me. And he showed me a lot about kind of the process and how to work with clients. Really, the difference between the arts and the applied arts, even though you're putting your heart and soul and passion into something, it's still, when it's for a film or television project, you're following somebody else's lead, and you need to not just sort of like lay down and say, yes, I'll do, you want to go left, I'll go left. You want to go right, I'll go right. You have to also find ways to stay inspired and come up with creative ways to, even if it wasn't the direction you wanted to go in that direction. And so I think that was very helpful in my path.
How did you get into movies and television writing? You know somebody? Because that normally is how it works in movies and TV.
It was a series of different things. It wasn't necessarily that I knew somebody. No, I think I could point to like 3 or 4 different nodes. First thing was, that band of mine, we were on the road. We had come back into the studio to work on our 3rd record. It was Atlantic Records. Atlantic Records said, there's somebody making a movie who needs an end title sequence. They brought the movie in. We worked to picture. I was like, wow, this is really fun. Like, we're sort of painting with music to picture in time, like in a timeline. This is like really creative and collaborative and storytelling. Going back to my upbringing, like my grandma, used to sit with me and like play me like Peter and the Wolf and point out the themes of the different. Suddenly I was like, oh, this is that. But here we are, like in a modern way, and it's fun. And then, and the technical side of it's kind of fun too. I was intrigued by that. So yes, I knew someone. I went to high school with a guy who was doing an independent film. He had like no money for it. It was called The Definite Maybe, ironically. We did that, my friend Sam Sokolo's movie. And that was kind of my first chance to do something. Not much happened with that movie. And then I moved to LA to try to make stuff happen in film and TV because I thought, well, there's more work out there for it. This was probably in the late 90s, 1997, 98. And then at that point, I was just sending music blind into different studios, and nobody would really pay me any mind. But I got a call on a Friday night from this guy, David Grossman, who was running the television music at Paramount. And he said, hey, there's an opportunity if you want on spec to write a theme song for a sitcom. If you write it tonight, do tomorrow. So no money, give it a whirl. So he gave me the brief with what they're looking for. I wrote this thing. He calls me the next day. He's like, okay, so they love it. They're not going to use it, but the head of the show would like it if you'd come to his house to write something with him. So I was like, okay. So this guy, Jonathan Katz, he actually had a show called Dr. Katz, where it was sort of like he was like a shrink and comedians would come in and it was sort of animated. Anyway, I go to his house. We write a song or two, like 20-second sort of goofy songs. Sunday, I get a call, or no, Monday. They're like, they loved it. They're not going to use it. The star of the show was Bob Saget. He had some friends who were going to do the theme song. Have you ever considered doing the music for a show? And I was like, would love to. And so that was my first gig. And from there, it was a series of things like, well, somebody knew me from that, and they allowed me to throw my hat in the ring for a bake-off for another show. And it was that kind of thing. And, I would do these bake-offs, where me and other composers would compete, score like 3 scenes or something like that. And I'd say, like, if I did 30 of them, maybe I won like 2 of them. That was enough in each case to like go to the next thing, and then you just keep going.
Our careers actually kind of crossed each other, because I noticed that you wrote the music for Legacy and I was a background actor in Legacy. So there you are. It is
Look
a
at that.
small world, because it was filmed here in Georgia. Yeah. So you've done maybe what, 20 different kinds of shows, and is that a roughly good number?
Probably like 100. Yeah, I've just been cranking them out between the films and TV shows. Yeah, and it's a lot of fun, but again, it's the applied arts. Sometimes it can be constraining.
Do you have a favorite contemporary composer yourself, movies or otherwise? Or a few, because I know you don't want to leave people out.
There's this woman, Gabriela Ortiz, who I like a lot. She's not a film or TV composer. She's just a contemporary composer. I think she's from Mexico. I heard some of her pieces performed at by the LA Phil at Disney Hall. Just fantastic. Very, textural and cinematic, but also like nimble and angular and kind of experimenting with some different sounds, like kind of slightly non-traditional orchestra setup, but also capable of doing like what your typical ensemble would do. So she's someone I really like. Arvo Part. In terms of the film and TV composer, there are quite a few doing good things. Alexandre Desplat, he does some great stuff. I like Michael Dana's scores. There's something about John Williams does arguably the most iconic stuff we've heard, and maybe is the most adept. He has incredible skills. A lot of his themes, I feel like they're kind of lifted from things you've heard.
I do notice that, for example, in the Harry Potter movies, the end pieces, the outros, are fairly complex, and they don't have that quality of, geez, I've heard this all before.
Yeah, no, they're incredibly creative. But some of the themes are like, one of them's like lifted right out of Firebird Suite. I mean, to me, I'm like, well, look, I'm not saying it's plagiarism. I'm not saying it.
Yeah, I got you.
There's stuff that's very reminiscent of something, but that's the world we operate in. You know what I mean? There's only so many notes. There's only so many permutations and combinations. Right. So to me, when I hear that, I'm like, oh, that makes sense that it's the love theme, and this is the princess thing from Firebird Suite. That intellectually, I'm like, I know why you would sort of use that as your jumping off point.
Right.
And similarly, like some of the kind of, it's heroic, and at this point, it's like we all just, when we hear da da da, like that's heroic. But is it derivative, Ride of the Valkyries or whatever, you know?
Yeah, it reminds me actually of the English composers, Elgar,
Uh-huh.
because they always had to include a march and everything.
So I mean, that's really what it is, right? It's a tradition. We're working in a tradition. There's some vernacular. You're lifting here and there and
Hmm.
moving it around. And I think the same thing with contemporary film, TV stuff. I hear a lot of the same sound being recycled, and I'm not really mad at it. I'm like, yeah, it's a wink and a nod to this one or that one. In terms of the what I know is happening behind the scenes, in terms of like how sausage is made, I know often a director or the showrunner got attached to a piece of music that was in the temp and fell in love with it, and the composer was up
Right.
against having to replace it. And in some cases, it's like, they're like, we really love this one sound. So you're like, all right, there's their sound. Melodically too, it's certain intervals create certain emotions. You know what I mean? Like when you're looking at people who are having a romantic thing, it's like there are progressions that give you that. If it's an action thing, there are, ways to use, odd meters or ramping tempos to sort of keep people on edge. And, there's little techniques that are just like, here's one of 3 or 4 ways to do it. And they work.
I did want to talk about elements four. When you begin to compose something like you're faced with a blank page, do you actually handwrite stuff or do you use composition software?
I tend to either play something on an instrument or use Pro Tools, digital audio workstation. I do like to hear it. I admire people who can just sort of like intellectually write it out. I like to hear the parts, and I try to let whatever whatever the star element is, I like that to sort of dictate the process a little bit. So if it's about the interaction between certain instruments, then I need to kind of get that dynamic happening. If it's about a solo instrument, then like I'll let that solo instrument sing, as it were, and then try and fit things around it. But it can work in a variety of ways. But yeah, that tends to be my sort of circle it.
In your head, where do you want it to be played? In a concert hall or?
Yeah, it would be great in a concert hall. When we recorded it in Budapest, it was a beautiful setting. But yeah, it would be nice for an audience to experience the wonder of it all.
You were actually on site when it was being recorded?
I conducted it. We had a 75-piece orchestra, a couple of featured soloists that were added later, particularly this Ngoni player, Baseku Kuyate, who's from Mali. And so most of the piece is kind of traditional classical music, but then in the third movement, where we, instead of doing like a scherzo, we kind of did like a world music 3/4 drum world thing where we had duduk and Ngoni with the orchestra. That was a little bit of a departure in the traditional symphony structure.
How many hours did you use to record it?
I think we did it in a single day, like an 8-hour day or something like that. The musicians were fantastic. I had the solo violinist and solo cellist like ahead of time. I gave them the parts so that, because some of them were kind of fast and complicated, so that they would come prepared. I think we got a great recording, and it was remarkable how smoothly it went, how well they did it there.
And so I assume in that 8 hours, part of it was dedicated to rehearsal and then recording?
We just recorded, and
Okay.
we would go back. We would do each section. We split, the 4 movements into like 8 parts and did each part multiple times. And, we would kind of go back, fine tune it. It really came together relatively quickly. And by the end, actually, we were like, well, now we've got a good sort of lexicon, how we talk about things, and everybody was pretty familiar with the piece. So we went back and kind of started from the beginning, and most of what got used is pretty much that last take.
You were involved in the post-production, editing, and
Honestly, there wasn't that much editing. It was really just using the right takes. But yeah, I mixed it. Fun. I enjoyed the process of mixing. Yeah, it was actually a very interesting, like when you work with like a band or something like that, and you have all of these different things you're trying to pull out and drums and stuff, it can be more complicated. When you're working with an ensemble recording, you don't want to pull at the clay too much. You want it to feel natural, like what happened. Because some of the mixing you're doing right there from the stand, you're like, okay, instead of the woodwinds being mezzo piano, let's be piano from bar 13 to 17. Like you kind of are mixing it on the fly.
It sounds like it's a facility unlike we can have in the U.S. in part because there aren't the limitations of a union contract, for example. They may have a union, but it may be different kinds of contracts.
I couldn't be signatory to a union session with 75 players, for something like this. So this enabled me to make this recording and be able to get it out there. And we're trying to use it to raise money for climate action, because the symphony is about climate change through the lens of the four elements: earth, wind, fire, and water. And so we have partnered with Earth Percent, which is like Brian Eno's charity organization. And we are diverting any funds that we can to these climate action projects that they're doing. I had to keep it kind of lean so that any money that we make can go. That was the impetus for going there. I've actually recorded in Budapest a number of times because they have a good orchestra. And again, some of these projects are non-union and some are union. And I had good experiences with them recording remotely. In this case, I got to go, which was great.
We have less than a minute. Great talking with you.
Great chatting with you, William. Thank you so much for having me. It's been
all right. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it, William. Thank you.
You bet. Hey, take care.
Take care.